So the third paper is the benefits trajectory and labor market experience of older workers who are denied SSDI on the basis of work capacity. And the presenter is Jody Schimmel Hyde, and the discussant is Laura Nichols.
Hi, I'm really happy to be here today. I am a product of the RRC from my graduate training, although I do want to acknowledge that this is funding from the DRC. And I also want to acknowledge April Wu, who I believe, along with my children who are eating breakfast in Colorado right now, may be on the webinar. They get to see mom work. So we were particularly interested in this study in looking at applicants for SSDI who were denied benefits because they were able to work. And this is not, all right. And I'll talk in a minute about exactly what I mean by this, but there's two different ways that applicants who are seeking DI may be denied benefits for the basis to work. One is because the disability examiner deems that based on their residual functional capacity or what they're still able to do when they seek benefits, that they're able to go back to the job that they held before disability onset. Or on the other hand, because if they aren't able to go back to that job because they're able to go back to another job in the United States economy. And I think it's really important to point out here that this doesn't necessarily take into account where the person is living and if that particular job is available, but another job in the US economy. And we're focused on older workers in particular, and I'll talk a bit about our sample in a bit. But for older workers who may be very wedded to where they live, this may or may not be a practical option for them. And so what we really wanted to know in our study was among older workers or older SSDI applicants who were denied for these reasons, what share actually returned to work and to what type of work do they return? And this is a particularly important question, I think. For us, we were interested in older workers because a really large share of SSDI applicants are over the age of 50. And while this is a difficult statistic to actually find, what I can estimate is about a third of applicants are over the age of 50. And in older ages, vocational factors, age, education, and work experience come into play when examiners are making determinations. So there actually isn't a lot of evidence basis for why these are the factors that are considered, but as applicants get older, it becomes more likely that they may receive an award holding other factors constant just because they're older. And so these denials based on work capacity assume that people can go back to work, or at least that's why they're denied benefits. But really, we wanted to know whether they do, and more importantly, thinking about policy, if they don't return to work, are there services and supports that could be beneficial to help people who may have disabling conditions but may want to remain in the labor force until they reach retirement? Are there supports that could help them do that? And sort of as a secondary question, and not one that we answer directly, but there's always talk about the consideration of vocational factors in the determination process. If we see that people aren't returning to work or they are, should the consideration of vocational factors be reevaluated? So to put a fine point on the groups I'll be talking about today, this is the 5-step sequential determination process that disability examiners use when reviewing the initial application to determine whether or not a person should be allowed or denied benefits. So the first step is they assess whether or not the individual is financially eligible for benefits. If they are, they determine whether or not they have a severe impairment at the second phase. And so at that phase, you may be denied benefit, or at the second step, you may be denied benefits at that step, and that's the group that we'll be looking at, sort of who were denied on the basis of medical reasons. So this group really didn't have a significant condition based on the way SSA looks at it. At step 3, they consider whether or not the person who has a severe impairment has a condition that meets or equals the medical listings. So this is a set of conditions that the examiner can compare the person's condition to and assess whether or not their condition meets or equals those listings. If they do, they're allowed benefits at that phase. And in the paper, we actually look at the allowed applicants, but for the sake of time, we're just going to talk about the denied groups today. And then at the point where they haven't been determined to meet or equal the listings, they calculate this residual functional capacity that sort of says what they're able to do. They then consider whether or not the applicant has capacity for their past work at step 4, and then whether or not they have capacity for any work at step 5. And so I'll be using these terms interchangeably, but really we were interested in this last 2 set of groups, the groups that were denied on the basis of work capacity. And the nice thing is our data actually allows us to separate out these 2 different groups, whether or not they were denied because they were determined to be able to return to their past job, or whether or not they were able to return to another job in the economy. So we used a health and retirement study to look at applicants who sought SSDI between the ages of 51 and the full retirement age. And these aren't necessarily first-time applicants, but they may have, about 10% of our sample actually applied prior to the age of 50 and hadn't yet received an SSDI award. But the bulk of these people are first-time applicants who are seeking benefits at older ages, so they have a pretty substantial job history at that point. And to determine whether or not they applied for these benefits and what the outcome of the decision was, we linked the HRS to a number of administrative records. First, we link to the SSA 831 files, which are files that contain information about initial applications to SSDI and SSI. We link to the cross-year benefits file, which contains benefit receipt information for SSDI and OASI, so we can determine both when the applicant applied for benefits and then whether or not they ultimately went on to receive them. And then the summary earnings file, which allows us to look at annual earnings for these for these applicants. And I think it's really important to note that while the HRS does ask for respondents to consent to this linkage to the SSA data, not all respondents do, and there's been a deep literature actually looking at the fact that the beneficiaries in the HRS who do consent to the linkage aren't nationally representative. Because the sample haven't really looked in detail whether or not applicants themselves are representative, and we didn't have a way to assess whether or not denied applicants in particular were representative of all denied applicants. We take the sample as it exists. We don't reweight. So this may or may not be a representative sample of all SSDI applicants. So what I'll report today really are the people that we have in the HRS, and we don't have a reason to believe that they're particularly unrepresentative, but I just wanted to provide that caution. So while the HRS is very rich and has a lot of information, once you start digging into the group that experiences disability and then seeks benefits, the sample gets small quickly. And so what you can see here is that we had a total of 805 applicants who sought SSDI after the age of 51. 421 received an allowance at the time of the initial application. And this isn't looking yet, and I will get to the point of what the ultimate outcome of these decisions were. People can appeal. This is just at the initial application. Of the 421 who were allowed, about 1/3 were allowed for medical reasons, and 2/3 were allowed for work capacity reasons. And basically that's saying that they were allowed because they weren't able to do a job. On the other hand, we have about half the sample was denied benefits at the initial application. About 1/3 were denied for medical reasons, and 2/3 were denied for work capacity reasons. And of those who were denied for work capacity reasons, 2/3 were denied because they were able to perform their past job, and about 1/3 were denied because they were found able to perform another job in the U.S. economy. And I think it's important to note that there are some characteristic differences between these groups. Relative to other denied applicants, looking across these three different groups, the medical denials and then the Step 4 and Step 5 denials, we see that applicants who are denied at Step 4, so denied because they can return to their past job, are more likely to be unmarried, more likely to be female, less likely to have a post-secondary education, and have a longer job tenure. So these are unmarried women who are working in relatively low-paying jobs, and these are people who, they seek benefits and they're told, no, we actually believe that you're able to return to your past job. Compared to that, the applicants who are denied because they're able to return to another job tend to be younger on average. In our sample, the average age at application is 58. The applicants denied at Step 5 are about 56 and a half. They're more likely to have post-secondary education, they earn a higher hourly wage, they have a longer job history looking for earnings between the ages of 22 and 50, and they have higher total household income. So this may be a group that's a little bit more mobile, which sort of correlates to the fact that the examiner determined that they were able to return to another job. They may just have more options for where they can work. So the nice thing about the 831 data is it allows us to consider the outcome at the initial determination. So the first decision that's received either at the initial or the reconsideration level, but a lot of individuals who are denied benefits appeal that decision. And so what we were interested in learning is how many of the applicants who are denied for work capacity reasons ultimately appeal that decision, and among those who appeal, how many were ultimately awarded SSDI. Similarly, some don't actually reapply or may be unsuccessful don't appeal and may be unsuccessful in their appeal, but they may go on to reapply. So that could occur because their health conditions are worsening. That could occur because they collect more medical information. And so we will also look not only at the likelihood of appealing, but also reapplying for benefits. And the reason this is really important for what we ultimately wanted to do is we were interested in the likelihood that these applicants go back to work, but we know that the eligibility for SSDI is predicated on an inability to engage in substantial gainful activity. And so most applicants who are seeking benefits aren't working while they're seeking benefits. And so to the extent that we see a lot of these people are denied and then are either reapplying or appealing, we would expect that there's not a lot of return to work activity during that time. And in fact, we found that this is the case. I've sorted here looking at the left column is those who were denied because they could return to their past job, then denied for another job, and then compared to those who were denied for medical reasons. And it's pretty notable that of those who were denied at the initial level because they could return to their past job, 2 and 3 ultimately either appealed or reapplied and were allowed benefits by full retirement age. And I should mention, we actually have some in our sample because we're using some of the early boomer cohort from the HRS. Not all of them have reached FRA. So we actually think there may be more who would ultimately be allowed DI by full retirement age if we observed them for this period. But 2 and 3 ultimately were allowed SSDI either because they appealed or reapplied, which is twice the rate for those who were denied for medical reasons. So the bulk of these people who are denied DI ultimately go on to receive DI. Only about 1 in 3 of those denied for work capacity reasons don't reapply for benefits. Some of those may have unsuccessfully appealed. You actually can't determine that from the 831 data. But the bulk of these people ultimately decide to go back and seek benefits. And since the average age at application initially is 58, we really don't think this sort of provides some evidence for what I'll show in a minute, that not a lot of these people are going to go back to work after they're denied benefits because they're either appealing or reapplying. And sort of related to this is that this is an older sample. So again, they're 58 when they apply. They're getting very close to the age at which they can claim Social Security retirement benefits. It's starting at age 62. And again, we don't observe everybody through full retirement age, but we see that virtually all of the people who aren't receiving DI claim OASI prior to the full retirement age that we can observe. So this is a group that's unhealthy. They were denied benefits for some reason, and either they're receiving SSDI, and if they're not able to receive SSDI because they don't receive an allowance, they ultimately go on to claim OASI. And this is pretty consistent with work that John Bound and Tim Wademan have done looking at sort of early claiming of OASI as a safety net for this group of disabled workers. So really, the bulk of these people that we see applying after the age of 51 for DI have some connection to the Social Security system by the time they reach full retirement age. So given the fact that we see that the bulk of these people are either getting DI or OASI, it shouldn't come as a surprise that very few of these people ultimately are returning to work, even though the examiner is saying, we believe that you can return to a job. And again, since I started with a sample of 384 denied workers and very few of these people are returning to work, you can imagine that the sample sizes as we go in the period after the decision is made gets very small, in the dozens. So I don't want to place too much credibility in the difference across these groups that we see, although the pattern is striking that regardless of the reason for decision, we see that in the years following the initial decision, the likelihood of working falls, it's down to 15% 5 years after application. So again, these are people who are 58 when they apply, so it may not be surprising that very few are working, although this is even lower than you might expect overall. So we see a really rapid decline during this period in the likelihood of work that really doesn't vary by the reason for denial. Very few go back to work. This actually looks at the average earnings among those who have earnings in the period before application and after the decision. And again, there's sort of a compositional shift here. The people who went back to work after their decision may be very different in the pre-period, and we haven't really looked at what their earnings were in the pre-period yet. But we see that earnings after the denial period are about 30 to 60% of what the average earnings were in the period prior to application. So for those who do go back to work, their earnings really don't recover. There was a recent study by the Social Security Office of the Inspector General, and then Strand and Trencamp have done work that's sort of similar in spirit to ours, but looks at across all ages. We find a lower share who return to work because we're considering older workers, but in terms of the wages that are replaced after denial, this is actually pretty comparable to what was found in the studies that really look across ages. So we really think that this is a pattern that's been found in a few studies now, that even those who are denied for work capacity reasons, among those who do go back to work, they really don't return to work at the capacity at which they had before they applied for benefits. So I think we've answered some questions, although I think many remain. Very few older SSDI applicants who are denied return to work, and those who do so at reduced earnings capacity. We really set out when we started the study to look at the types of jobs that denied applicants return to. But like I mentioned, by the time we were looking at applicants in the dozens, we didn't have a lot to be able to compare pre-post changes in occupations. So what we're actually trying to do now is look at the occupational characteristics of applicants before they sought benefits. So looking at, were they working in manufacturing jobs? Were they working in jobs that had high stress, high physical demands? And we're doing this using the HRS unmasked occupational codes linked to the Department of Labor's ONET data. And so for this, we have information on the occupation, the individual reports. It'll allow us to look at sort of the unbiased characteristics of the job based on what the Department of Labor has collected to look at the types of skills and abilities that applicants had before they sought benefits to look and see whether there are any differences. And our hope there is that we'll be able to find that there are certain types of occupations that may benefit from an early intervention type approach to help individuals remain in the labor force and perhaps not even seek benefits, through accommodations to stay working rather than going down this benefits claiming path if they're able and interested in continuing to work. So 0 seconds. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.